Hello everyone, it is Joe here from OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. And today we are looking at a quad Glaceon list. Glaceon, one of the most hyped cards coming out of the Ultra Prism set, because it does carry that really annoying ability that can really stop people playing. And as we know, when people can't play the game, they will often lose the game, and that is just a simple fact. So Glaceon has been getting a lot of attention, and a lot of people are trying to build this deck very differently. We think we've got a good baseline list for a quad version, but there may be others to come. So, let's kick off with the basic concept. We have got the English scan, thanks to PokeBeach, on the right side of your screen there, so you can see it in full. But it's a simple concept. Just like how Trev can win games in the opening turns by locking out items, we're going to try and use Glaceon GX's Freezing Gaze ability to really reduce the opponent's outs into getting set up. Namely, we're removing Ultra Ball plus Tapu Lele from their deck from being good outs into getting early game supporters and making things like Bridget less of a commonplace turn 1 play. And that's what a lot of decks do require in order to get their setup going. Not to mention that throughout a long game against decks like Zoroark, which are, you know, among the top tier decks right now, pre-Ultra Prism, never being allowed to trade because we're playing a quad variant, is going to be absolutely insane. The entire advantage of playing a Zoroark deck is removed because you're preventing it. So this is definitely going to have an impact on the format because it instantly on turn 1 can prevent Tapu Lele coming down. It also prevents Zoroark GX and things like Decidueye GX. Plenty of very, very relevant GX Pokemon currently in the format which Glaceon can turn off. So you will naturally have some good matchups just by getting your ability into play. Also, thanks to Eevee, just like how we've seen with Sylveon, where it just plays 4 Eevee and 3 or 4 Sylveons, we can do the same with Glaceon, thanks to this amazing ability on the Eevee, which then means we have enough space to go a little bit crazier with the list and just play the 4 basic Eevees, and then have lots of disruption cards, and that's the build we're going to be showing you today. Then, finally, just a quick note that Frost Bullet and Polar Spear GX do synergize with one another very nicely. 90-30 then puts damage on the things that you can Polar Spear later on in the game, and additionally, you can be targeting lower HP, basic evolving Pokemon with this Frost Bullet, and alongside some of the disruption cards, we can prevent the opponent from evolving on the following turn, or hope to make it difficult for them at the very least. And if we are able to do that, we can score multiple knockouts both in the active and on the bench. So really, really synergistic with the playstyle of the deck. We're trying to disrupt, trying to stop them getting their progress into the game, and being able to not only damage the active but also target some bench Pokemon is going to be really synergistic with the playstyle of this list. So let's get into the Pokemon. I did mention we were a quad list, but we are actually playing one Espeon EX as well for Miraculous Shine, just because I feel like there are a few cards that can really snowball out of Glaceon's control, and that's some of the Stage 2 cards out there actually, because Stage 2 non-GX Pokemon like Vikavolt and Magnezone coming out in Ultra Prism can pretty much snowball through Glaceon, and then they just power up attackers every single turn, and we can't do anything about it. So now, with Frost Bullet, hopefully we can set up these Magnemites. Obviously, only if they're using the Free Retreat Magnemite, we have to mention. If they're using the Hard Unit Magnemite, we can't access them with Frost Bullet. But also things like Grubbins, and then Miraculous Shine them later on. I think we don't have a win condition against those decks without having the Espeon EX in here, so that's why we have made the space for it. But other than that, we are playing a thick 4-4 line of the Glaceon, a full 4 count of Glaceon GX. I actually talked to Xander about his quad Sylveon and why he played 4 copies of Sylveon. Why not just play something like 1 Rescue Stretcher, 1 Super Rod? And it's just having access in the deck. It's quite simple that you have flexibility even if you prize them and such. So this is just the safest way of going about it, and you can always proc your energy evolution, and that's what's really important, especially for this list, because if ever you put down an Eevee that can't evolve into a Glaceon, then your opponent has Guzma outs to remove our ability lock. So always being able to drop an Eevee and instantly evolve it is going to be a priority for this deck. So that's why we're going for the full count of 4 Glaceon GX to round out 9 Pokemon total. No Tapu Leles, no Tapu Kokos, even though they do have things like getting you supporters, which is obviously amazing, and extra spread utility. We don't want to lead with anything other than Eevee. The Espeon GX is a risk, but I think we can't win some matchups if we don't play this card outside of just crossing your fingers that Freezing Gaze means that they never get set up. That's always kind of the win condition of this deck anyway, but I think they just have so many options to beat us throughout the game. They can have like 4 slow turns and then eventually get their stage 2 up and then start swinging, and we would still get outpaced because we're doing such limited damage with Frost Bullet, especially things like Bulu that can heal off damage from Frost Bullet. So I think overall the Espeon EX is required in the quad list, but I guess, I mean, you can take it out if you just feel like you lead it too many times, but statistically it won't happen all that much, so I think it's kind of okay. Onto the items, we're going to play 1 copy of Pal Pad. We play a few 2-of supporters and only 3 copies of Guzma in our list, so Pal Padding these back is going to be really helpful for certain matchups, and this is going to be really good. We do play a couple of Acerola, we play things like Flare Grunt, so respamming these in a similar way to how you've seen Lucamine in other stall decks. The Power Pad is going to help us out in this regard to make sure we have enough fuel to get through the game. We're going to play 2 copies of Field Blower. Field Blower going to be the only thing that can test stadiums. We're not playing any of our own. There aren't any that are too powerful for us. Parallel City has anti-synergy because if we're trying to limit their bench, then we reduce our own damage output because we're of course a water type. If we're going to reduce our own bench, it doesn't really do much to us. Things like Mount Lalakila or Potown would probably be the best ones that you could consider, but for now I'm going for Field Blower because you also get the utility of getting rid of Float Stones and getting rid of Choice Bands, and that could also really help out at keeping you out of range of certain attacks at times. So I think it makes sense to play the Field Blowers over just regular stadiums right now because there isn't any single stadium that you just think, man, this synergizes so well with Glaceon GX. Maybe in Expanded you play Rough Seas, that seems to be more important. Getting some heal to stay out of 2-hit KO range could be insane, but in Standard, Field Blower seems the best option. 3 copies of Aqua Patch. We do have Acerola, and I think the reason why we can get away with that card is because we have some acceleration from Aqua Patch, so if ever we can tank a hit with Glaceon, we can patch the bench, attach a DCE, Acerola the active, and still be okay to continue attacking, which is nice, and just some added attachments here and there can help out against 1-hit KO decks. If ever they do get set up, you can respond on them quite nicely. So I think 3 copies is kind of fine. We don't need a full 4. I think 3 is safe. 4 copies of Nest Ball. You just want to get your Eevee out and then insta-revolve it into Glaceon. Seems pretty reasonable. We're not playing Bridget because we don't want to get multiple Eevees down all at once because, as I mentioned earlier, you will then just get Guzma out of your lock. So you want to get individual Eevees. That's why we're playing the Nest Balls instead. 4 copies of Red Card. Now, there are probably some veteran players out there who remember things like Toad Red Card, and even in the Liverpool Regional Championships, there were a few players playing Mega Sizzle that also played Red Cards. Both lists got to top 8, actually. 2 of the 3 players playing it got to top 8 of Liverpool Regionals back in 2016, I think. So, yeah, Red Card in combination with Silent Lab back then was a very potent strategy to try and prevent the opponent from doing anything. Well, Glaceon GX is basically an inbuilt Silent Lab, if you consider Tapu Lele to be the thing that you're trying to shut off. So just spamming the red card, lowering your opponent's hand size, really reducing the outs is going to be a great way to really deny the opponent from doing anything, and that's really the main win condition here, trying to give them fewer outs just by having a Glaceon active, and then even fewer again because we're reducing their hand size to just 4 cards. So that's really, really potent, I think. 4 Crushing Hammer complement this, so whenever the opponent does get anything going, you can try and start removing it ASAP. Choosing this over Enhanced Hammer, just because it is more universal. Even though it is a coin flip, I think it's just more safe right now to have a more universal approach than fitting in Enhanced Hammers, but depending on where the metagame lands, you can start trading these in and out for Enhanced Hammers as you wish. 2 copies of Choice Band. It does help out our math sometimes with a GX attack. And additionally, just in general, 90 isn't always getting 2-hit KOs, so the Choice Band on top of that will help you get 2-hit KOs in almost every situation. So this is very, very useful for increasing our damage output. On to supporters. Couple Acerolas, as I've already mentioned, it can help out when you think about things like Tapu Lele GX. Even if they can't get the ability from Tapu Lele, it can still work as essentially a Lugia EX of old, where they just stick a DC on and start swinging against your Glaceons. it's actually annoying to deal with, and they can start taking prizes just by rocking with Lele. So having Acerola in here to mitigate those things in the early turns is obviously going to be very good for you. We do have the Power Pad to maybe recycle these if need be, and alongside the Aqua Patches, I believe it could be worth it. We're playing a couple of copies of both Cynthia and Sycamore. Both have their value. Cynthia can help you retain cards like Crushing Hammers, Flare Grunts, Guzmas for later on in the game where they're going to be more valuable, whereas Sycamore can help out getting Waters in the discard pile for your Aqua Patches. So I believe a split is correct. I haven't landed on one that I think is always better. I think they're both powerful draw cards, and I think incorporating a couple of each, especially alongside Power Pad, is a pretty decent strategy. 3 copies of Guzma. We're trying to close the game out very quickly, and targeting down the most important threats in the early game is probably the best way that we can do that. Also, when we're doing early snipes on other things, the opponent may send in, for example, a 60 HP Pokemon that we've already hit for 30 damage, then we can Guzma it away, and then hit something fresh in the active for 90, and the 30 snipe then finishes off the 60 HP Pokemon. That does come up a decent amount of times, so Guzma's going to be nice for making sure we can cash in on as many prizes as possible in the early turns. 4 copies of Flare Grunt, because as I've mentioned, we're going to be lowering our opponent's hand size, lowering their options. I've already mentioned that Tapu Lele is a big issue, so having answers in Crushing Hammers and Flare Grunts to stop them simply just going with Energy Drive when they have nothing else going for them from being a valid approach. These sorts of things really help out, and it can really slow down their tempo, which is definitely a big deal when the opponents can't use Tapu Leles throughout the game to recycle their hands as effectively. Then just 4 copies of N. We still need some shuffle draw on our own end, and if the game does go longer, you're going to start going behind in prizes more than likely because they get set up. It's going to be down to cards like Red Card and N to stabilize you once again to reduce their hand size and maybe lock them out all over again. So it kind of feels like a Toad deck where you could go behind in prizes quite easily, then N plus shoving Glaceon in the active can lock the opponent out of many outs to win the game on their own end, so you can have a few turns of just going for Frost Bullets and eventually get there. Finally, for energy, we're playing 14. I know it's a lot, but you want to have as many waters as is reasonable so that you can get into your Glaceon on turn 1 and establish your lock, and then have plenty to keep putting Eevees down and evolving them as we go. It also gives us plenty so that we can discard them with Ultra Ball, or sorry, we don't play Ultra Ball, with Sycamore, so we can get Aqua Patches working for us, which is pretty nice, and alongside 4 DCE, of course, helpful for both of our attacks, which is just a no-brainer, to be honest. So it is a high count of energy, but I think it's pretty reasonable, alongside 3 Aqua Patch to make sure we can pressurize early, and that's what the deck is trying to do, because the ability is so frustrating for the opponent to deal with. So here is the overall list. Take the screenshot now. It will also be in the description. And yeah, pretty simple stuff. I think trying to lower your opponent's tempo with the help of Flare Grunts and Crushing Hammers seems to be a reasonable approach. I think it's not quite the same as something like Sylveon, where you can play even more disruption cards like Lusamine, Delinquent combo alongside Stadium, stuff like that. I think we're trying to close out the game much, much quicker than the Sylveon, essentially making sure the game never begins is Glaceon's approach, whereas Sylveon is trying to win in a longer game by grinding them out. We're trying to make sure the opponent can never get playing in the first place. So although there are similar counts in here, although it's still a quad evolution deck, they will play very differently in how they try and approach the matchup. We're trying to cheese the win in 3 or 4 turns as best we can, whereas Sylveon wants to go long and grindy. So let's look at some tech options for this deck. I did mention Potown as a potential option. If there are evolutions around, you can definitely synergize this alongside your Espeon EX play and the fact that we are doing some spread already, and it even synergizes with the GX attack against things like 2 10 HP Pokemon. So Potown definitely could be a good stadium. For now, I'm not playing it. You could also play it alongside Delinquent for more hand disruption. So that could be an option for you. Things like Lusamine and Judge, potential extra options. If you're not happy with the red card, potentially Judge could be your turn 1 play to try and limit your opponent's hand size. My biggest issue is that it reduces your own hand size to 4 as well, so you can get stuck on your own end, especially because we don't play Tapu Leles for ourselves. So that feels kind of awkward. Even with a high energy count, it may be a little bit counterintuitive and could end up you being the one who's got a dead hand and not your opponent. And finally, I have mentioned that currently DCs are like really high priority in lots of decks. That's because Zoroark is so potent. There are also a few other special energy decks around right now, so if you want to start removing things like Crushing Hammers, you can move into Enhanced Hammers, or even start looking at something like Assault Vest. This can really help out at keeping out of 2-hit KO range from things like Tapu Lele and things like Zoroark. This is often the sort of panic mode that the opponent will go into. They don't have much going on in their hand, so they just rock with Lele and start going for energy drives. So having the Assault Vest in here is going to greatly reduce the effectiveness of that approach. So it is a little bit awkward. Obviously, you can't Choice Band and Assault Vest at the same time, so your damage output's a little weak, but it's still enough to get over a Tapu Lele in 2 hits regardless, and the Assault Vest can definitely make you a lot more tanky and make you a lot less reliant on Acerola, so definitely could be an option for this list. I haven't gone through any matchups with this deck because really our attempt is to not make the game ever go long. I think naturally we'll have bad matchups against the metal decks, especially if they're playing Registeel, because that with Choice Band can put a big amount of work in against us. We will definitely start to need things like Acerolas and whatnot to come back in that matchup. So that's something we do have to be concerned about. As well as just going first for the opponent is always like kind of a downside for this deck, because they can get Bridgeting, get their setup to start getting online. So that's kind of awkward. There's also things that play like Devolve, like if Buzzwole starts teching in something like Espeon EX, they can devolve your Eevees, and that is a weak underbelly that these quad evolution decks have always struggled with. So bear these things in mind. There are definitely issues for Glaceon, but I didn't feel like putting a matchup spread because you can pretty much beat anything if you just lock them out of the game. And you can also pretty much lose to anything if they just happen to get like Sycamore off their 4-card hand and start getting into all the pieces they need to get going. So I think there will be inherently bad matchups for you, but at the same time, there's nothing that you can't beat as Glaceon just because of that factor of them having no playable cards for a few turns, and then you just announce your attack to KO whatever it is on their board in the early turns. So that's why I didn't do a matchup spread, but you can pretty much make it up for yourselves. We have weakness to metal that we can't really get around very easily, especially even the Magnezone lists have Dialga for clock up, so if they could get any sort of semblance of board going, they can probably still draw out of all the locks we're trying to put against them. And things like Flare Grunt and Crushing Hammer don't matter too much when they have the Stadium anyway, and they can just Magnezone at some point. So there's going to be inherently bad matchups, but also ones that we just cheese out because they have nothing going for them. And that's kind of what we're trying to go for with this deck, as sad as it sounds. So here are some closing thoughts for the deck. Your win rate will be so much better going first. Just like Trev, you're going to be head slapping when you see your opponent flip over that Eevee as they go first and attach the water energy. It's going to be very awkward for you. It really will be much, much more dangerous when they do go first. That's just inherently how the deck goes. One big thing to note, I think what's most important here, is that both this and Garchomp have very inherently favorable matchups against Zoroark. As long as you're playing the fighting Garchomp and some strong energies, that should be a good matchup against most of the Zoroark builds. And the fact that we shut off trade with Glaceon and the fact that we have so much energy denial means we can probably out-resource the Zoroark deck before they take the 6 prizes. So just like other mill decks, we can win. And the fact that they don't get their draw engine online at any point in the game means we'd probably have a really good matchup against Zoroark. So definitely threats for Zoroark with the new set coming out, and it may be taken off its top tier pedestal if there's enough of these counter variants running around for Zoroark. So that's definitely something to be concerned about. And the final thing I'll mention is that, yes, this is a quad build. Yes, we are trying to not allow our opponent to play the game. But if it turns out that this ability from Glaceon isn't enough to prevent the opponent from playing, and if the opponent's decks do start moving away from the reliance of Tapu Lele and start going for higher physical support accounts, it may mean that we can't play a quad list very effectively, and we have to start playing tech Pokemon. There are plenty of options out there. You can play your own Zoroark, for example, because Glaceon's lock is one-sided. You could play things like Ninetales, and there's a few other options that people are considering, even things like some basic water types that can take advantage of Aqua Patch. Even things like Lapras have been banded around as potential options. So it looks like if Glaceon isn't enough to lock out the game alongside Energy Denial, we may have to move out of a quad build and leave that to the likes of Sylveon and other decks out there. But for now, I feel this is a strong variant, and can simply win off the back of the opponent not drawing into their outs, which are significantly reduced when you do have that Glaceon sat in the active position for the entire game. So that is my thoughts on the deck. Hope you did enjoy this video. We probably will have more Glaceon variants out there because the quad list may be a little bit too YOLO and may not work out in the end, but I felt this was a good starting point, trying to cash in on the ability as much as possible, seeing as that is the strong point of Glaceon, trying to make it as effective for as many turns of the game as possible. Feels like a pretty good strategy to me. Let me know what you guys think about Glaceon and this list. Let me know what else you want to see from Ultra Prism. There's still plenty more decks to come, some new decks before we start revisiting the old ones as well. I think a lot of people are ready to start seeing how the current decks adapt to the new format. So there's going to be plenty more still on the channel to go with this new set, and I feel like it does have a big impact overall. So going to be interesting for the next couple of weeks, and stay tuned for all of that good stuff. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And it has been Joe from OmniPoke, and I will see you guys next time. Cheers.